Can the man who's been trying to kill you for hours suddenly become your savior? When you're wounded and helpless in the Vietnamese jungle, when an enemy soldier finds you bleeding and defenseless, when everything you've been taught says he should finish you off or take you prisoner, what does it mean when he instead gives you water, bandages your wounds, and disappears back into the jungle without a word? And if that enemy can show compassion when he has every reason to show cruelty, what does that say about the nature of war and humanity and the lines we draw between us and them? I'm 74 years old, and in 1968 I was a young Marine in Vietnam who experienced something that challenged everything I believed about enemies and war and what it means to be human. This is my story, and the story of other soldiers who encountered unexpected compassion from the people they'd been sent to kill. Moments that revealed humanity surviving in the darkest corners of combat. Instances that forced us to question whether the enemy was really as inhuman as we'd been taught to believe. My name is Thomas William Chen, and I was a 23-year-old corporal in the United States Marine Corps in 1968, serving with 1st Battalion 9th Marines, operating in Quang Tri Province near the DMZ. I was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, had enlisted in 1966, partly out of patriotism, and partly to prove that Asian Americans were as American as anyone else, to demonstrate loyalty to a country that had interned my grandparents during World War II, but that I still believed in despite its imperfections. I'd been in Vietnam for 7 months by August 1968, had fought in numerous engagements, had seen friends killed and wounded, had killed enemy soldiers myself, and had developed the hardened mindset that infantry combat requires, the US versus them mentality that allows you to function when the alternative is to be paralyzed by the moral complexity of killing other human beings. We'd been taught in training that the enemy was ruthless, that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army showed no mercy to prisoners, that they tortured and murdered Americans whenever possible, that they were essentially subhuman, driven by communist ideology and hatred of freedom. Some of that was propaganda designed to make it easier for us to kill them, but some of it was based on documented incidents of prisoner abuse and execution. We'd seen the evidence, had heard the stories from survivors, had been shown photographs of American POWs who'd been tortured, so we believed the enemy was cruel, believed they'd show us no mercy if the situations were reversed, believed the war was a struggle between civilized Americans and barbaric communists. But on August 23, 1968, I learned that reality was more complicated than the propaganda suggested, that humanity could survive even in combat between enemies who'd been taught to hate each other, that compassion could emerge in the most unexpected circumstances. My platoon was conducting a patrol through jungle-covered hills, looking for NVA units that intelligence suggested were operating in the area. We made contact mid-afternoon, a brief but intense firefight that left 2 of our men wounded and scattered the platoon across maybe 200 meters of terrain. I was with a fire team that got separated from the main platoon during the firefight, 4 Marines who were trying to link back up with our unit while avoiding the NVA soldiers who were still in the area. We were moving through dense jungle, following a trail that we thought would take us back to where the platoon had established a rally point, when we walked into an ambush. NVA soldiers opened fire from positions we hadn't detected, and in the first burst of fire, Private Rodriguez went down, hit multiple times, and Private Wilson was wounded in the leg. Lance Corporal Morrison and I returned fire, tried to suppress the NVA positions, but we were outnumbered and outflanked, caught in a kill zone with no good options. Morrison was hit next, took rounds to the chest, went down hard, and I was alone, still returning fire but knowing I had maybe seconds before the NVA closed in to finish the job. I felt the impact before I heard the shot, a massive blow to my right side that spun me around and dropped me. I'd been hit by an AK-47 round that entered just below my ribs, tore through my abdomen, and exited out my back. The pain was indescribable, paralyzing, and I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't move my legs, couldn't do anything except lie there while my blood soaked into the Vietnamese soil. I could hear NVA soldiers moving toward our position, hear them checking the bodies of my fallen teammates, hear Vietnamese voices discussing something I couldn't understand. I was waiting for the shot that would kill me, the coup de grace that wounded enemy soldiers received in the field when prisoners were inconvenient. But the shot didn't come. Instead, an NVA soldier appeared above me, a young man maybe my age, his AK-47 pointed at my head, his face expressionless. We made eye contact, and I saw him making a decision, calculating whether to shoot me or move on to the next body. I couldn't speak, couldn't beg for mercy, could only look at him and wait for death. But instead of shooting, he knelt beside me, checked my wound, said something in Vietnamese I didn't understand. Then he did something that makes no sense in the context of combat. He pulled a field dressing from his pack, the same kind of bandage we carried, and pressed it against my wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. He worked quickly, efficiently, like he'd done this before, bandaging my entry and exit wounds, packing them with dressings that probably saved my life by preventing me from bleeding out in the next hour. Then he pulled a canteen from his belt, held it to my lips, let me drink the water, the most precious thing I'd ever tasted. He said something else in Vietnamese, his tone not unkind, then stood up and disappeared back into the jungle with the other NVA soldiers, leaving me alive and bandaged when he'd had every reason and opportunity to kill me. I lay there for maybe 3 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, before a Marine patrol found me and called for medevac. The helicopter arrived, took me to a field hospital, and surgeons operated to repair the damage the AK round had caused. I survived, spent 6 weeks recovering, and was eventually sent back to my unit. But I never forgot that NVA soldier, never forgot his face or his actions, never forgot that he'd chosen compassion when cruelty would have been easier and safer for him. I told the story during my debriefing, and the intelligence officer looked at me skeptically, suggested I was confused from blood loss or trauma, implied that enemy soldiers didn't bandage wounded Americans. But I knew what had happened. Knew I'd been saved by the compassion of an enemy soldier who had every reason to hate me, but who'd chosen to treat my wounds instead of finishing me off. That experience challenged everything I'd been taught about the enemy, forced me to recognize that they were human beings with individual consciences and moral choices, that the war was more complex than simple narratives of good versus evil allowed for. I wasn't the only American who experienced unexpected compassion from the enemy. Over the decades since Vietnam, I've met dozens of veterans with similar stories, men who survived because enemy soldiers made choices that contradicted their training and ideology. Moments of humanity that emerged despite the brutality surrounding them. These stories have been largely forgotten or dismissed, don't fit the comfortable narratives we prefer about war and enemies. But they're real, and they matter because they reveal something fundamental about human nature that war tries, but fails to completely destroy. I met a veteran named Robert Harrison in the 1980s at a VA hospital where we were both receiving treatment. He'd been a rifleman in the 101st Airborne, had been wounded and separated from his unit during a firefight in 1969. He'd crawled into a tunnel to hide, had passed out from blood loss, and had woken to find a Viet Cong soldier standing over him with a rifle. But instead of shooting him, the VC soldier had given him water, had helped him out of the tunnel, had pointed him in the direction of American lines, and had melted back into the jungle. Harrison had made it back to his unit, had survived his wounds, and had spent decades wondering why that VC soldier had spared him when killing him would have been trivially easy. Another veteran, James Mitchell, told me about being trapped under heavy fire with his squad in a village in 1968. They'd been pinned down for hours, were running out of ammunition, were certain they were going to be overrun and killed. But during a lull in the fighting, an elderly Vietnamese woman from the village had crawled across open ground under sporadic fire, had brought them water and rice, had whispered in broken English that NVA soldiers were planning a night attack and that the Americans should withdraw before dark. Mitchell's squad had used that intelligence to break contact and survive, saved by a Vietnamese civilian who had risked her life to warn them, despite having no obvious reason to help the foreign soldiers who'd brought war to her village. These stories, and dozens like them, suggest that even in the dehumanizing context of combat, even between enemies who'd been taught to hate each other, humanity persisted, compassion survived, individual moral choices could transcend the broader conflict. The soldiers who showed mercy, who bandaged enemy wounds, who shared water with men they'd been trying to kill minutes earlier, who warned of attacks or helped the wounded reach safety. These men were making choices that their commanders probably wouldn't have approved of, that their training had discouraged, that their survival instincts suggested were dangerous. But they made those choices anyway because something in them recognized common humanity, refused to reduce the enemy to a dehumanized other, insisted on maintaining moral principles even in circumstances that seemed to render such principles irrelevant. The question I've pondered for decades is what motivated these acts of compassion, what allowed enemy soldiers to see Americans as human beings worthy of mercy rather than as targets to be killed. Part of it was certainly cultural, Vietnamese traditions emphasizing compassion and respect for human life, that survived even communist indoctrination and the brutality of war. Part of it was individual conscience, soldiers who couldn't bring themselves to execute helpless wounded men regardless of nationality or ideology. Part of it was recognition of shared experience, combat soldiers on both sides understanding what the others endured and feeling kinship that transcended political differences. But I think the deeper explanation is that the dehumanization necessary for sustained combat is always incomplete, always requires conscious effort to maintain, always breaks down when you're face to face with an individual enemy rather than an abstract threat. When that NVA soldier knelt beside me and saw my wound and my fear and my humanity, he couldn't sustain the propaganda image of Americans as inhuman monsters. He saw another young man far from home, wounded and helpless, and his human compassion overrode his military training. In that moment, I wasn't an enemy to be killed. I was a wounded human being who needed help, and he responded to that reality rather than to the ideological framework that said I should die. The implications of these acts of compassion are profound and troubling for anyone who wants to maintain simple narratives about war and enemies. If enemy soldiers could show compassion, could make moral choices that contradicted their training and ideology, could recognize our shared humanity despite everything that separated us, then what justification was there for the dehumanizing propaganda we'd been taught? If they weren't the monsters we'd been told they were, if they were capable of mercy and compassion and moral complexity, then what did that say about the war and our role in it, and the moral framework we'd been using to justify killing them? I struggled with these questions for years after Vietnam, couldn't reconcile my experience of being saved by an enemy soldier with the narratives I'd been taught about the war and about the enemy. I'd killed NVA and VC soldiers myself, had felt justified in doing so because I believed they were essentially evil, driven by twisted ideology and hatred of freedom. But if they were capable of compassion, if they showed mercy when they didn't have to, then what did that make me for killing them? Was I a defender of freedom, or just another participant in a brutal conflict where both sides committed atrocities and both sides showed occasional compassion and neither side had a monopoly on righteousness? These questions drove me into deep depression in the years after Vietnam, contributed to PTSD that went untreated for decades, made it difficult to integrate back into civilian life. I couldn't talk about my experience because it contradicted the approved narratives about the war, because people didn't want to hear that the enemy had shown me mercy, because acknowledging enemy humanity complicated the simple stories we told ourselves about Vietnam. It was easier to maintain the fiction that we were good and they were evil, that American soldiers were heroes and enemy soldiers were monsters, that the war had clear moral lines and unambiguous justifications. But in the 1980s, I started meeting other veterans who'd had similar experiences, who'd encountered enemy compassion, and who'd been similarly troubled by what that meant. We formed informal support groups, spaces where we could discuss these complicated moral questions without judgment, where we could try to make sense of experiences that didn't fit comfortable narratives. These discussions were therapeutic, helped us process the cognitive dissonance between our experiences and the stories we'd been told, allowed us to develop more nuanced understanding of the war and the enemy and our own roles. One insight that emerged from these discussions was that recognizing enemy humanity didn't diminish American soldiers' courage or sacrifice, didn't somehow invalidate the war or make our service meaningless. We'd fought bravely for what we believed were legitimate reasons, had tried to protect each other and accomplish our missions, had endured hardships and trauma that deserved recognition regardless of the war's ultimate justification. The fact that enemy soldiers were also human beings capable of compassion and moral complexity didn't diminish what we'd done. It just made the war more tragic, made the casualties on both sides more regrettable, made the whole enterprise seem more like a waste of human potential. Another insight was that these moments of compassion, these instances where individual soldiers on both sides chose mercy over cruelty, represented something precious that deserved to be remembered and honored. In the midst of dehumanizing violence, in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy every trace of human decency, these soldiers maintained their moral principles, refused to become the monsters that war tried to make them, chose compassion despite having every excuse to choose cruelty. That deserves recognition, deserves to be celebrated as evidence that humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Over the decades, I've tried to tell these stories, to share experiences of enemy compassion with audiences who might not want to hear them, but who need to understand the complexity of war and the persistence of humanity. I've spoken at schools and churches and veteran gatherings, have written articles and given interviews, have tried to complicate the simple narratives about Vietnam and enemies and what war does to human beings. The reception has been mixed. Some people appreciate the nuance and the moral complexity. Others accuse me of being unpatriotic or of giving comfort to the enemy by acknowledging their humanity. But I persist in telling these stories because I believe they're important, because they reveal truth that propaganda obscures, because they honor both American soldiers who showed mercy to the enemy and enemy soldiers who showed mercy to Americans. These weren't frequent occurrences, weren't common enough to change the character of the war, but they happened often enough to prove that humanity persists even in combat, that individual moral choices matter even when larger forces seem overwhelming, that compassion can survive circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. I've often wondered what happened to the NVA soldier who saved my life, whether he survived the war, whether he went home to family and career and normal life, whether he ever thought about the American Marine he'd bandaged instead of killing. I've wondered if he struggled with questions similar to mine, if he questioned whether showing mercy was wise or foolish, if he was haunted by the moral complexity of war just as I've been haunted. I'd like to believe he survived, that his compassion didn't get him killed, that he'd lived to see peace and to know that his choice mattered to at least one American who owed him everything. In the 1990s, with Vietnam opening to American visitors, I considered trying to find him to return to that jungle hillside and somehow locate the man who'd saved me 30 years earlier. But the practical obstacles were overwhelming. I didn't know his name or unit, had only a face that I'd seen for maybe 5 minutes, had no realistic way of identifying one soldier among millions who'd fought for North Vietnam. So I abandoned the idea, accepted that I'd never know what happened to him, tried to honor his memory by telling his story even without knowing his name. But in 2008, something remarkable happened. I was contacted by a Vietnamese-American woman named Lisa Nguyen, who worked as a translator and who'd read an article I'd written about my experience. She said her uncle, a former NVA soldier named Nguyen Van Tan, had told similar stories about showing mercy to wounded Americans, about bandaging their wounds and giving them water despite having been ordered to take no prisoners. She wondered if perhaps her uncle might have been the soldier who'd helped me, suggested we could meet and compare details to see if our stories matched. I was skeptical but desperate enough for closure that I agreed to meet. Lisa arranged for her uncle to come to San Francisco, and in September 2008, I met Nguyen Van Tan for the first time since August 1968. We were both in our 60s, gray-haired and marked by age, but when he walked into the room I recognized him instantly, knew immediately that this was the man who'd saved my life 40 years earlier. His face was the same, his eyes were the same. The recognition was mutual and immediate and overwhelming. We talked for hours through Lisa's translation, compared details of that day, confirmed that we'd been on opposite sides of the same firefight, verified that he'd been the one who'd bandaged my wounds and given me water. I asked him why he'd done it, why he'd shown mercy when killing me would have been easier and safer. He said through Lisa that he'd been raised Buddhist, that his beliefs emphasized compassion for all living beings, that even communist training hadn't completely erased those principles. When he'd seen me wounded and helpless, he'd seen another young man suffering, and his compassion had overridden his military duty. He'd risked disciplinary action or worse by helping me, but he'd made the choice anyway because he couldn't bring himself to execute a helpless, wounded man. I thanked him, inadequately, for saving my life. Told him about the decades I'd lived because of his choice, about my wife and children and grandchildren who existed because he'd shown mercy. He cried, said he was glad his choice had mattered, said he'd carried guilt about the Americans he'd killed during the war and that knowing he'd saved at least one helped balance the moral ledger. We embraced. Two former enemies who'd tried to kill each other 40 years earlier, now connected by a shared experience that transcended the conflict that had defined our youth. That meeting gave me closure I'd sought for decades, allowed me to thank the man who'd saved me, confirmed that these moments of compassion were real and significant and worth remembering. Than and I have maintained contact, correspond regularly, consider each other friends despite having been enemies during the war. He's told me about his life, about returning to Vietnam after the war, about struggling with his own PTSD and moral questions, about trying to build a peaceful life after years of combat. Our experiences parallel in remarkable ways, suggest that the trauma and moral complexity of war affects soldiers on both sides similarly. I'm 74 years old now, and that moment when an enemy soldier chose compassion over cruelty remains the most significant experience of my life. It saved me physically, allowed me to survive and come home and live a full life, but it also saved me spiritually, proved that humanity persists even in war's darkest moments, demonstrated that individual moral choices matter even when larger forces seem overwhelming. That NVA soldier, that young man whose name I didn't learn for 40 years, gave me more than just medical treatment and water. He gave me hope, gave me evidence that we're not defined by our worst moments, gave me proof that compassion survives circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. The broader lesson from these stories of enemy compassion is that war, for all its brutality and dehumanization, can't completely erase what makes us human. Individual soldiers on both sides made choices that contradicted their training, that honored moral principles despite enormous pressure to abandon them, that recognized common humanity despite ideological and national differences. These choices weren't common enough to prevent the war's atrocities, weren't frequent enough to fundamentally change the character of combat, but they happened often enough to prove that humanity persists, that compassion survives, that even enemies can recognize each other as human beings worthy of mercy. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about war and enemies and what it means to be human, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from Vietnam veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember that wars are fought by human beings, that enemies are people with consciences and moral complexity, that compassion can survive even in combat's darkest moments. Remember the soldiers on both sides who chose mercy over cruelty, who maintained their humanity despite every pressure to abandon it, who proved that what makes us human is stronger than what divides us. Thank you for listening to this old Marine story about the enemy's compassion and the humanity that survives even in war.